Teitelbaum, and I'm the director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And my father taught me a long time ago never to believe everything people say about you. So there's nothing Marion said that I completely believe, except to say that I will try my very best to move things along and be a moderator in service of our purpose. I want to say that museums are in a particular moment, and I believe anybody working in museums must be confused, must be worried, must be in the midst of rethinking focus, purpose, and the utility of our projects. I think if we don't, we miss an important moment of reflection. In fact, I'd go further. I think if we don't reflect and consider in order what we can do, what can be the greatest value that we can provide to the communities we serve, we'll miss a moment to recreate our museums for the next generation. So this is all to say that I think this conference happens at the right time. I want to acknowledge that the conference in English, I want to say that that is meaningful, and it is a commitment on behalf of so many speakers whose first language is not English, and I want to acknowledge that. I want to apologize up front for some of my pronunciations. I will try my best. But it leads me to share the following story. I asked Florence and Uta for translations of some of the speakers' names. And this morning in my hotel room, I was going through them all. And there was Neil MacGregor coming up. I thought, well, let's find out how to pronounce Neil MacGregor's name. So I pressed the button, and it was in an accent that I just can't do. So I don't know I don't know what I'm gonna do. But I thought that was very earnest and a very sweet moment. I want to say that introducing Neil is complicated for me because if you've ever heard Neil introduce others, there's nobody better. Eloquent, witty, to the point. So I'm taking a very simple way out. I'll say something at the end. I just want to read what is in the brochure. Neil MacGregor studied philosophy, law, and art history in Paris, Edinburgh, London, and Oxford. He taught art history and architecture at the University of Reading and was the editor of the Burlington magazine in London until 1987. Subsequently, he served as director of the National Gallery in London. In 2002, he presided over the British Museum in London in the role of director. I said to him yesterday that he's now a lapsed director. There he presented, amongst other things, the series A History of the World in 100 Objects, accompanied by a corresponding exhibition and publication. And in 2014, he curated the exhibition Germany, Memories of a Nation, which was also in view in the Martin Gropius Bau. In 2015, he was appointed head of the steering committee at the Humboldt Forum. He has received numerous awards as an art historian. Most recently, he was awarded the Frederick Gundolf Prize, the German National Prize, and the Goethe Medal in 2015. I want to say that Neil is the gold standard for me as a museum director. Not a gold standard, the gold standard. He is purpose-driven, he's ethical, he's engaged with contemporary issues while thinking about how we can keep the past alive. And to listen to Neil is one of life's great pleasures. Neil MacGregor.
Thank you very much indeed. As you will all have gathered, nor should you believe everything that Matthew says, but he did pronounce my name very prettily. So thank you very much, Matthew. And I should like to start by thanking those who've organized this conference, Marion Ackermann, Andreas Gergen, and for organizing it at this moment. As Matthew said, all of us who work in museums at the moment should be worried and confused. And I'm afraid that what I'm going to do in the next 40 minutes or so is share my worries and confusions. But it is a very good moment at which to do it. And Dresden is surely the place to do it. The demonstrations by Pegida some years ago shocked the whole of Europe. The action of Hartwig Fischer, the director then, and of Marian Ackermann since, showed what a museum can do to assert a certain kind of statements and a certain kind of values. And I take it that that is what we are here to talk about. Museums as public statements of values and of tolerance. I found the title, as Marian said, very fascinating. I think we can safely say only a German could have invented this title. And it reminds us all why we love Germany. The role, I think, is clear that we're talking about a public social role, not so much the intellectual, academic role, the social role of museums. In complex political times, I would like to ask the organizers when they thought political times were not complex. I think what we're saying is the role of museums as societies change. And the best of all, of course, was complex political times in Europe. Now, I don't know what that means, in Europe. Is it the political times in Europe that are complex? Or is it the encyclopedic museums in Europe that are complex? And is it about our role in Europe only or not? Those are some of the questions I do want to ask. Is the role of an encyclopedic museum, and most of them for historical reasons are in Europe and North America, how does it relate to our own society and to the society of the rest of the world outside Europe? And my key question is, who are these collections for? Who do they belong to? But above all, who are they for? Why are they here? And who are they for? And I want to start with an object. I must ask, first of all, permission and forgiveness of the director of the British Museum. The only museum I know anything about, really, is the British Museum, and a little bit about the museums in Berlin. So I'm afraid I'm going to be talking about the objects for which Hartwig Fischer is responsible. I'm sorry. I think this is quite a good place to start. In the 1730s, Admiral Anson, a British admiral, set off to sail around the world. It was a typical British naval expedition. The aim was largely to find new maps and explore the Pacific, to chart the Pacific, using the new technology, not just of the ships, but of the chronometers, of the clocks, to draw maps, longitude, to know what the world was and where things were. It's quite important, I think, that at this stage, 1730s, in the Pacific, this was nothing to do with annexation, occupation, or whatever. It was, of course, hoped that profit would come, but nobody knew where it was going to lead. Anson set off and went around the Cape Horn, around the south of South America, and then set off across the Pacific. And as he had hoped, on the way he came across a Spanish ship carrying over 1 million pieces of 8 silver coins from Peru to China. He captured it, took all the money, and became extraordinarily rich. And when he came home, he ordered, or when he was in China, he went to China first, he ordered a dinner service in Chinese porcelain, paid for with the silver stolen from the Spaniards, which had been, of course, mined by the indigenous Americans. And this is one of the plates. And it's, I think, a very good image of a certain kind of enlightenment. The bottom, Anson's coat of arms, because with so much money he had to become a nobleman, of course, so those are the coat of arms. And on either side, on the right-hand side, you can see the port of Guangdong Canton in China, on the left-hand side, you see Plymouth in England. So every day he dined between Plymouth and Canton. And on every plate in the middle was this view of a different part of the Pacific, the islands that he had discovered or that he had revisited, and with indication of what plants grew on it, this being a particular kind of bread tree. It is the whole Enlightenment European engagement with the rest of the world. It's about technology, it's about curiosity, it's about bravery, it's about greed, it's about showing off. And it is also about realizing that you are part of a world which is one in a quite new way. This is the moment at which it's possible to have an encyclopedic museum, because only when you can sail around the world and come back can you collect the world. So this plate is, if you like, stands at the head of all our encyclopedic museums, with all the confusions of motive, and just at the moment when the technological advantage is still not with Europe, but with China. 1730s, Dresden is just beginning to replace porcelain from China with porcelain from the Elbe. But not yet. Real porcelain is still Chinese. And this is still, I think, just one final point on this about how it reflects our world. The silver he stole came from Potosi, the great mine. In Spanish to this day, to say something is worth a fortune is to say vale un Potosi. It's worth the whole mine of Potosi. In French, if you suddenly discover that you've got a huge amount of money, you say c'est le Pérou. And in English, if you don't want to do anything, even in spite of a lot of money, you say you would not do it for all the tea in China. Our languages still carry all these resonances of this kind of explanation. This is, if you want to be heavy about it, the deep colonialism in the mind, or is it just part of a history that we no longer know really what it means, but it has shaped all of us and part of our world? That is, I think, those are the two readings. This explains why the first public museum, national museum, aimed at showing the whole world was in London. London, as the centre of shipping, was better placed than anywhere else in the world to collect objects from the whole world. And I want to make clear this is not about art. This is not an art museum. This is a museum about understanding how people live, how societies work. There is great art because societies don't work without art, but it's not there because it's an art museum. Founded by the Parliament in 1753, a number of things about the British Museum set the pattern and the questions for all museums of this sort, trying to show the collections and the cultures of the world. It was to be aimed at universality. Every culture was, if possible, to be there. That was the hope. It was to be free to everybody, because it had to be available to everybody. And at the heart of it was the question of what it means to be a citizen in a new global order. Anson's plate showed that the world had changed. It was never going to be the world of the 17th century again. There was a new global order. What did it mean to be a citizen in it? And the most important exhibit in the British Museum, when it opened, was Magna Carta, the document of 1215 where Parliament forced the king to recognize the rights of at least the nobles, if not exactly the people. This is very important. This is why this is not a royal museum, because at the heart of this museum is how you resist royal power. That's why it's a parliamentary museum. It's about enabling the citizen to take a stand against their own society, against their own ruler. It's a fundamental question, and it's the radical distinction between the English-speaking tradition of museums and the French-speaking one. French museum tradition is about the state, the ruler, control by the political institutions. British one, quite the reverse. No connection with government, indeed not allowed to be connected to government. Andreas Gergen, were he to be transmuted into an 18th century British person, would have given a very different speech today. It's free because only if it's free can it play its social part. And one of the questions I do want to ask you and all of us is how can our museums play a role in complex political times if large numbers of our citizens can't afford to come in? One of my great disappointments has always been how few curators in continental Europe believe in the value of free admission. I think it's quite fundamental if we want a social role for the houses. And what is the point of it? As I say, it's about being yourself in a new global order, a citizen of a new world. And the model, I think, for a collection like this is really Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels, you remember, you go off to a strange world. You look at it, you're amazed at it. But the point is not really to think about that strange world. It's to come back to your own and to see it for the first time, and to see what's wrong with it and what needs to be changed with it. There's a double vision in all universal museums, all encyclopedic museums. Of course, to learn about the other, but also so that you can then better conduct yourself. They raise a very interesting set of problems. This, as you can all see, is the Museum Island in Berlin, with the Humboldt Forum with some of the facades of the reconstructed 17th century castle at the back. Declared by UNESCO to be a World Heritage Site, a site therefore that belongs to everybody. But not the contents, only the buildings. And I think this is a very interesting question. If we have a notion of world heritage, what does it mean? Is there such a thing? If there is, what does it mean for us who are responsible for them, and what does it mean for the rest of the world who are able to be part of them? In these universal encyclopedic museums, the aim was to go from the very beginning, from the objects like these hand axes made in Africa nearly 2 million years ago, that enabled human beings to spread around the world. And one of the purposes, very clearly, in the 18th century, was to show the oneness of humanity in its different forms. Less a concern with the other, more a concern of how people like us behaved differently. That shifts, of course, later on. But this phenomenon of a shared humanity, one experience, one story, is still a central debate. Do we have one story or not? What are the challenges in our complex political times? I think most of us would agree, if we're talking about Europe, that the key ones that museums might have a role to play in are immigration, the nationalism that goes with that, and the xenophobia that goes with that. I think we need to address also the question of religious intolerance. Right across the world, religion is now again central stage in politics. You cannot understand the modern world without the political dimension of religion and questions of global injustice. Some of those I think we can think about usefully through our collections. Very quickly, I want to begin with nationalism and the construction of a fantasy image of a nation, the fantasy image of ourselves. It was something of a surprise when I was director of the British Museum that the Scottish government asked for this object, the Lewis chessman, to be returned to Scotland as part of the great year of the homecoming. They claimed that they were found on the island of Lewis in the 1820s, and they are medieval chessmen, as you can see, fascinating, beautiful carvings in walrus ivory, and the Scottish government decided they were icons of what it meant to be Scottish. This is where the museum can play a real part, because the research of the museum can show without any difficulty at all that this is actually made in Norway, was actually made for the market in Ireland, and only wound up on a Scottish island because we don't know why. But it has nothing to do in its making or its shaping with Scotland, anything less than the game of chess itself. It is a critical role for us in the academic world. What Edward Said called in the last edition of Orientalism talked about the duty of this philological research to show the untruths behind a national identity which is false and created. The fantasy image of ourselves, I think most of us in this room are fairly clear about. The fantasy image of the other is, of course, much more complex. And I want briefly to look at this. This is the kind of object, it's about almost life-size, that used to stand regularly outside tobacco shops in Europe and America at the end of the 19th century. And here we have the image of the American Indian. An image so strong that I imagine some of the older people in this room also grew up with it, as still in the books that were at home, or indeed in the films. And here, the museums can do something else. Here is the representation of another culture by Westerners, by Europeans. In the 1890s, Bastian, the great director in Berlin, decided that this was ridiculous, and that what had to be allowed was to allow an American Indian, as he would then have called them, to present their own culture. Luckily, he found an American Indian who was also an ethnographer, Francis Laflèche. And Laflèche was invited by Bastian to go and buy and put together a collection of his own people, the Omaha Indians. And the Omaha Indians were asked to present their own story through objects to the public in Berlin. The objects are still there, and Laflèche explained they were all used regularly until he acquired them. As you can see, the one pipes on the right are part of the so-called peace pipe story. Objects like the headdress, and then everyday objects like the shoes. What is fascinating about this is the note with which Laflèche sent these objects. He says, the breakup of the Omaha's native organization, the overthrow of their religious rights, and the destruction of the authority of their chiefs and of their tribal order, the confusion of mind following this sudden overwhelming of ideals and familiar forms of social life. These are a sorry story, full of pathos and instruction, but they must be omitted here, as it forms no part of my present duty. It's a very fascinating statement. A man who knows his society is being destroyed, is about to perish, presents the evidence of it, but feels he's not allowed to say why and what's going on. One of our challenges as we present cultures from all over the world that we know are also being destroyed is how do we make sure that the Laflèche of today is allowed not just to present the culture, but to tell the story of what is happening to it. And it's not just, of course, this kind of object. The other key bit of understanding culture is the immaterial cultural heritage. And Berlin was the great pioneer of collecting this kind of material. That what makes a culture is not the objects only, but the songs, the dances, the stories. And so in Berlin, and it will, we hope, be one of the key points of the Humboldt Forum, will be a chance to show these astonishing records of historical recordings made by people of what was then their traditional world. That's one aspect, clearly. How do we allow people to tell their own story in the terms they choose? But I want to talk about another bit of immaterial culture. and the bit that we don't like to talk about. One of the things that has travelled extraordinarily well in terms of integration in Europe is food. European food has been particularly lucky, of course, if you live in Britain, where growing up with British cooking tradition, the arrival of Indian immigrants was an enormous relief, and curry has become a national dish. But all across Europe, it's the same pattern. And in Belgium and the Netherlands, you can see feta and Greek cheese and Greek moussaka become very popular. This image appeared, this is the packaging for their food, and you'll notice at the top there is Mediterranean Greece with the brilliant blue and the characteristic little white painted church with its blue dome. No sooner had this gone on show or gone into the coolers, the fridges of the supermarkets, than it was pointed out that actually something very odd had happened. The cross had been removed from the actual church, which you see on the right, when it was to appear as part of Greece on the left. The supermarket chain which did this, whose name I shan't mention, explained that they had done this out of respect for religious diversity. And this, I think, is a very extraordinary phenomenon. You respect religious diversity by not allowing expression of any religious symbol. And it is, well, you could imagine, it certainly would cause one, shall we say, to smile at the checkout desk. But it became something of a cause célèbre across Northern Europe about what was going on. And it was particularly interesting to me because at the Humboldt Forum, one of the decisions was taken to reconstruct the historical facade of the 1700s palace, including the cross on the top of the cupola. This led to the most enormous debate. Should there be or should there not be a cross on the top of the Humboldt Forum? This, I think, is a problem we've got to address quite seriously. How do we deal with religion in European society today? UNESCO, rather fascinatingly, lists rituals, food, music, dance as immaterial heritage, not religion. I would argue that one of the great disasters of the French museum tradition was the absolute separation of religious objects from their purpose and their history when they were removed into the Louvre in the expropriations of 1793. It was not allowed to go on being seen as a religious object. The key part of its history was destroyed. And that was fine as long as the division, the separation between religion and the public realm was more or less true, certainly in Europe. The assumption that a society functions without a religion and religious practice being part of that society is now a Western European conviction. For most of the world, it is incomprehensible. And if we are going to look at ourselves, go on a Gulliver's tour and come back and see what's strange, perhaps the strangest thing of all is the idea that you can separate the patterns and the rituals of belief from the behavior in daily and public life. But that is what our museums are in different countries predicated on. And here, I think it's important to say we do not have European traditions. We have European values of tolerance, European values of peaceful debate. Different European countries have completely different histories in this matter. And it's a critical matter for our society and for our museums. You'll all remember the moment 2 years ago when Muslim women in the south of France were arrested for wearing too much. Normally on the beach you get arrested for not wearing enough. And here is a woman being removed by the police because she was wearing a burkini, which was thought to be somehow an offence to the agreed way of thinking and behaving of the society. That decision was eventually overturned by the Conseil d'État nearly a year later. But the problem is a very wide one. What is to be seen, what is to be hidden, and who decides? And if your culture is to hide in the public and open in the private, what do you do with that? This means the book has nothing to do in a free country, is the headline. And it is the question I don't think we want to ask. How do we present religious objects in our museums, but mostly in a tradition that has removed them from their purpose, and where mostly it's denied and they're treated as part of an art history. But if we want to understand the others who are now our European fellow citizens, if we really want to know what they think and how they feel, we have to know what it means to practice a religion. We have music of all sorts, poetry of all sorts, dance of all sorts in museums. What is the proper role for the presence of religion? I don't know, but I think it's a question which is absolutely central. In Berlin, there was a very brave and very successful attempt at the Museum for Islamic Art to invite Syrian refugees to take people round the museum saying what the objects meant to them. Very often the religious significance, but talking about it very much as art, a lot of which was still Islamic, and very important it was. But again, you hit the immediate problem of who can afford to go to this museum? Who can afford to come to listen to these talks? If you don't have free museums, who are you reaching? Who do you want to reach? In the British Museum, the decision was taken to present the preparation of the statue of the festival of Durga Puja, the great festival in Calcutta every autumn. The goddess Durga, who is being painted with the many arms behind. Her festival comes September, October every year. A temporary statue is made of enormous elaborateness, painted in the streets, not in the temples, and is then put back in the Ganges. It's a very important part of Bengali life, and it seems to me perfectly proper that this activity should be carried out publicly in a public space. The decision that we came to, or the community, the local Hindu community who were doing it, did not want to have religious ceremonies in front of it. They took place in the temple. If they had, what would have been the proper answer? People loved watching. You can see what a London population looks like, what a European population now is. If we're to understand our fellow citizens, I think this is part of what we have to do. It is a shared heritage of the whole world. We are in a world that since the 1720s, 1730s has become more and more interconnected in every way. And the question, I think, about politically complex science in Europe is also about how does Europe relate to the rest of the world? And how does it live with that history of which Anson's plate, which was about European powers fighting European powers, as well as all of them raiding the rest of the world. How do we live with that inheritance? It's another place, I think, for Said's recommendation of philological research. The origin of the objects is every time different. This throne from Cameroon in the Ethnological Museum in Berlin was a present from the king in Bamun to the Kaiser. From a very unequal relationship, it was nonetheless a present. He was disappointed that he didn't get the German throne back in return, which I think he was rather expecting. The story is in many ways tragic, moving, funny, but also honorable, because at least on the Cameroon side there was a sense of a discussion between two rulers. Completely different from the story of the Benin heads come from, taken by the British in a punitive raid in Nigeria in 1897, brought to Europe and sold at auction to pay for the punitive raid. And most of them bought by Berlin, which is why actually there are more of the Benin bronzes in Berlin than in London, rather surprisingly. A very different history, very complex, and again, the relation to Germany, very different. What do you do? How do we carry out these conversations? And in our own archives, are there archives in the source countries? What does it mean? The biography of the objects before and after is, I think, the critical thing. And here, I think we've got to remember that objects like this had a long life before they came to Europe, and have had a long and great influence since coming to Europe, and that the colonial chapter, which must be told, is part of a very large narrative. And it's not just the acquisition of the physical things which is problematic. The recordings the sound recordings went on collecting objects as well. But most of all, in Germany, in the early 20th century, in Berlin, recording accent voice poetry. First of all, with native Germans on a voluntary basis. And then, in the prisoner of war camp in the First World War, the huge prisoner of war camp in Berlin, the realization that people from all around the world could be recorded. And a scientific endeavor to make prisoners from different countries speak, say their prayers, sing their songs. It's an archive of astonishing power, but who does it belong to? It's a history which is extremely problematic, and yet it is a resource incomparable. I'm showing you the most interesting one, perhaps of all, which is of Korean soldiers. You won't need me to remind you that in 1914, there was really no Korea. It was a Japanese colony. It had been destroyed as a country. But there was a large emigration from Korea to Russia. And those Koreans in Russia, mostly from Vladivostok, came to fight in Europe with the Russian army, were captured by the Germans, and recorded. This is now the oldest and fullest record of Korean folk song, folk music, and poetry that exists from this period. But who does it belong to? And if it belongs to Korea, which Korea? These are really fascinating and difficult questions. And come back to the single question: what is it all for? And who tells the story of the objects? It's a very critical one. The British Museum has collections from Australia, gathered particularly in Tasmania, in very, very black circumstances. There was effectively a genocide in Australia. These objects tell the story of a culture that doesn't have a written record and whose own memories have certainly been disturbed, even though they are still present, as Roxley Foley will tell you later. The decision was taken. The curator of the British Museum is an Australian Aborigine. She worked with communities in Australia, and the exhibition went to Canberra. 2 stories were recovered, different stories put together. But who has the right to tell the stories? And what is our obligation to show the objects? These went to Australia. An object like this, the cylinder, which records the conquest of Babylon by the king of Persia in 539, before the Common Era, is part of the history of Iran. It was found in Babylon in Iraq, but what it says on it is the text which allowed the Jews taken prisoner in Babylon to return to Jerusalem. Who gets to tell this story? The British Museum lent it to Iran, knowing that Iran would use it as part of its demonstration. It had always been a great liberal power when it was allowed to run the Middle East. Everything ran smoothly. Other narratives would be different narratives. The German concept of Deutungshoheit, control over the story, is, I think, an extraordinarily difficult one. And holding the objects may be one thing, holding the story is a problem we need to address. And that brings me finally to the question of how can we deal with these objects. I believe, and I hope I've shown why, these collections are of enormous value in allowing us to understand the world, allowing the rest of the world to understand themselves, and allowing ourselves to think differently about ourselves. But if that's so, if the Encyclopedic Museum is a powerful instrument to make a global citizen, then we need more of them. And that means, I think, that they all need to become lending libraries. Hartwig Fischer is going to be next month in Mumbai, in the museum there, where the museum is presenting a story of India, but India in the world. And the Indian objects will, of course, come from India. The objects from the rest of the world will come from the British Museum. So in the entrance hall of the museum, here, a wonderful entrance hall, will be the Diskopolos. There are very few great Greek-Roman sculptures in India. They must be seen. It is objects of this sort that I think is part of the challenge for the Encyclopedic Museum. How do we lend, it's not just how did the objects come and what is the debate between the source country and the holding country. Anthony Appia would argue far more important is how do we make sure that the whole world gets to see Greek sculpture or Benin sculpture. And I think that's one of our big challenges. Either from the, so objects like this will be going, and this extraordinary throne made of the weapons used in the Mozambique Civil War. A great document of European, murderous European intervention in African politics. Every rifle from which this chair is made was made in Europe. These, I think, are objects which, like all objects, have to travel far beyond their source country and far beyond museums that hold them. Who is the World Heritage for? What does it mean to be a citizen in this new global order? And I think, how do we ensure that as many people as possible come to see them? Thank you very much.